For 50 years, I had no idea that my concept was used on the 3 lunar rovers. I found out from a former colleague of mine, Frank Pavlics, who had been a project engineer on these lunar rovers, the Apollo lunar rovers. Delco products delivered to the GM Defense Research Laboratories, and what was then delivered to Boeing for incorporation on the Apollo rovers.
The story of Fernce is widely told. It is a story of genius, heroism, and creativity. A fascinating man that remains to this day, just minutes from where the Lunar Rover was developed in Santa Barbara, California. I can't even begin to measure the level of this man's genius. Suffice it to say, he was 88 years old when I met him, and most recently, had been involved as a consultant on the Mars rover. That was history I didn't have to recall with an enormous amount of effort. I had called fruitlessly beforehand and left several messages. I assumed that no response was tendered because of his celebrity profile. As I stood in front of this man's door, on the side of a beautiful mountain in Santa Barbara, in a community full of palatial homes, overlooking the vastness of the Pacific Ocean, I wondered, do his neighbors realize that this man is one of the greatest minds of the 20th century? That all the interesting things of the universe could be debated with him? Standing there with my father and an armload of original factory documentation, my hand trembled as I rang the doorbell. I was unannounced and expecting nothing. As his presence graced the open door with a glint in his eye, I began to stumble through the ramblings of our visit. Thank goodness for my father and the General Motors documentation that broke the ice. After a few moments of sizing us up, he invited us into the beauty of his home and the uniqueness of his storied life. I took up space on the floor of his living room as he perched himself in the adjacent Lazy Boy recliner. I felt like a young man who was meeting his hero, and goosebumps became evident on my skin. After 40 minutes of laying out the reason for my unannounced visit and outlining the entirety of our factory documentation, he made the connection. This is the man that's been accredited for the design of the Lunar Rover, and I don't think he had ever been asked about the contributions of the men that came before him. He had known Paul D. Aggarwal well. He remembered days of these programs at the General Motors Defense Laboratories that amazed me. The research of Paul Aggarwal and his team during their time in Santa Barbara had been focused on what he called Earth Tech. Although this team's work had been utilized in the Lunar Rover astronaut mobility training vehicle that was used to teach astronauts Louisma and Carr to use it in Pismo Beach, California, Moon Tech was his brainchild. He pointed at the original photo of the mobility test unit and said, "That's your connection." The advances in electric drive and propulsion that were widely documented in my paperwork did not represent the changes that had occurred when NASA gave Fernce the final requirements for a voyage to the moon. The mobility test unit was designed and built by General Motors and Aggarwal. It weighed 850 pounds and used a total of 6 horsepower, he said with a knowing smile. Pre-existing concepts that were thought to be viable had to be completely rethought to design and rebuild a revised rover that weighed only 600 pounds and could be folded up like a collapsible suitcase. The new specs were daunting, and they were the fruits of his labor. I explained that I was not trying to give credit to individuals that were involved in the final lunar build, just document the men that came beforehand. That's when the culmination of all of our research came into focus. I showed him the picture of the pilot prototype Camaro used in the study at the Tech Center, and he began to do the math. It was conclusive. We understood one another. He was the creator of the Lunar Rover used on the moon, and I was the young boy asking questions about a Camaro. If the men I had documented in our research were geniuses before their time, this man was truly a visionary of epic proportions. Advances and theories were utilized by the men and research of the General Motors Defense Laboratories that came prior. Their programs understood, but ultimately, his team had to start over under the revised paradigms. I began to videotape and write at the same time. My theories were all validated at this point. I told him the story of my grandmother's escape from war-torn Germany after World War II, and the smartest man that I have ever met began to articulate his life story. It was a moment in time that I will always remember. Frank Pavlics was born on February 3, 1928, in a small town in Hungary. He had 8 brothers and sisters, and his parents were both school teachers. He flourished in school and advanced very quickly in math and science. He graduated from high school in 1946 and began to strive for higher education at the Technical University of Budapest. It was a difficult time, living amongst the ruins of World War II, and times were hard. He worked part-time salvaging steel from damaged buildings and graduated from university in 1950. The Soviet Union had imposed radical communist reform agendas, and the public unrest was brewing. In the fall of 1956, the Hungarian Revolution would erupt and would lay turmoil to the lives of everyone involved. This uprising would ultimately only last 6 weeks, but would leave Budapest in ruins from the Soviet occupation. Frank and his wife Clara stayed during the turmoil, hoping that the revolution would succeed. Well, the revolution didn't succeed, and after this became abundantly evident, the two of them decided it was time to escape. They initially took the train to within 20 miles of the Austrian border, then walked for 3 nights under the cover of darkness to arrive at the border town where his brother lived. On the 29th of November, they ran across the border with the aid of his brother and brother's wife, a local butcher, and a sympathetic soldier. After 3 months of sleeping in refugee camps, they were granted visas from the United States and endured a 14-day journey across the Atlantic. Frank was offered a job within 5 days of arriving in America from General Motors. He was a special man that was afforded an interview in German. The man conducting the interview was originally from Poland and was none other than Dr. Becker. Frank would spend his storied career under the mentorship of Dr. Becker, and his relationship was akin to father and son. The year was 1957. The two of them would work in the same tank division as Thomas Putnam, where Frank was tasked and became an expert in traction and mobility while studying soil samples for this tank division. In 1961, General Motors moved Frank's division to Santa Barbara, where he answered to Donald Freeman and Howard Wilcox. This was the exact time and auspices that the electric drive division was being created in Santa Barbara. While Frank was working on traction and mobility on the moon as the lead engineer, Paul Agrawal was beginning his work in electric drive technologies. On September 12, 1962, John F. Kennedy announced to the world our desire to go to the moon.
We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
His mentor, Dr. Becker, was quick to respond with the first such paper of his kind in January 1963, called Mechanics of Locomotion and Lunar Surface Vehicle Concepts. It was during the time between January 1963 and the spring in 1969 that these teams worked and collaborated with one another. Paul Agrawal's team of electric drive personnel focused on the necessary components to design and create a battery-operated vehicle and electric drive systems utilizing the original patent that was creatively designed by John Worth. Technology that would ultimately lead to the creation of Electrovair 1, Electrovair 2, and Electrovan. The research and design of electric drive, traction drive, suspension and steering, and drive control electronics were instituted and heavily collaborated with for the design and build of the Lunar Roving Mobility Test Unit used to train the astronauts in operational skills in 1968 in Pismo Beach, California. Mobility testing was also achieved during the same time.
Temperature. If the batteries became too hot or too cold, the entire rover would stop working. A conventional liquid cooling system with pumps and pipes was always going to weigh more than 10 pounds. Some ingenuity was required.
Through these years, Frank's efforts were focused for end uses on the moon. These programs included different versions of lunar terrestrial vehicles until the final specs were received at the request for available space aboard the pending Apollo mission.
We came up with vehicle concepts of the wheel type, track-laying vehicles like tanks. We even looked at an Archimedean screw in case everything's submerged under the surface, it can borrow itself through the loose material.
This is the point where acquired technology would have to be mildly altered. They would have to shoehorn a Jeep-sized vehicle into a compartment the size of the back of a station wagon. After months of extreme recalculations and design changes, the answer came in the form of a spring-loaded hinged chassis and wheels. Armed with the attitude of a man that had grown up facing adversity, he started building a scale model for presentation to NASA. It was a family affair. His wife sewed the seat, and he stole his son's G.I. Joe action figure for the remote control display. And in typical Pavlik fashion, he remotely drove that scale model toy into the office of Dr. von Braun to get his attention. Yes, Dr. von Braun, the same pioneering rocket scientist that drove Germany's domination of the science before and during World War II.
Proceeded to his office,
knocked on the door, opened it.
And I guided this little model into his office. Now, he was at the telephone at the time. I looked at his face, and I saw just a great surprise.
He slammed the telephone down and says, "What have we here?" That gave us a great opportunity to explain to him what we had. We had already made a film, so we showed him a very short film on how it worked. We demonstrated to him.
So we spent as much as a half hour with him in discussing the concept, and he became very enthusiastic and supportive of the idea.
He said, "We must do this."
History knows this moment to be successful, and a tasking team for lunar roving was created on April 7, 1969. On October 28, 1969, it was official. The Lunar Rover was going to the moon. Over the next 17 months, Frank Pavlics and Sam Romano began building the revised rover. I use that loosely. These were the brightest minds in the world working for the General Motors Defense Laboratories that had already created the ability. They understood the science, and it was design changes only. They were, however, design changes never confronted by engineers before.
We came up with an idea of folding it together. So first we had to fold the seats down. Then the end of the chassis was hinged and folded over 180 degrees. The forward chassis section was also hinged and folded over. Then the suspension linkage was designed such that folding in the wheels, they assumed a 90-degree angle. So this package now could fit into this triangular envelope at one corner of the lunar landing module.
Unknown soil composition, 1/6 gravity, total vacuum, and temperature fluctuations between plus or minus 250 degrees made this a daunting task. Collaboration from all involved companies included General Motors Research Laboratories, Delco Electronics, Boeing, and Marshall Space Flight Center. Tires couldn't be rubber, they would melt or freeze. The result was a wheel and tire that was made of mesh that didn't hold air. It flexed using the strength of its many applied parts and could withstand 600 pounds of impact if it struck a rock on the lunar surface traveling at 10 miles an hour. 2 weeks ahead of schedule, the Lunar Rover was delivered to NASA on March 10, 1971. It was installed in its flight position on the Apollo 15 lunar module and was subject to constant review prior to launch on July 26, 1971. It was launched successfully and made 3 excursions during the moon landings. And aside from an electrical connection that ultimately made contact a little late, it operated flawlessly. After the historical reminiscing was finished, Frank went to the closet and returned with some prototype Lunar Rover parts. My favorite was the wheel and tire design that only weighed 12 pounds and was made of exotic alloys. I took a video of him while he was smiling ear to ear while discussing the nuances of moon tech.
We couldn't use rubber tire, but it behaves like a soft rubber tire.
That's neat how that.
Have good flotation
Right.
and traction.
The conversation continued to the patio where the panoramic view of the Pacific was so overwhelming. It was there that I learned how important his sons were to him. He explained that he decided to continue alone on the side of this mountain because his boys considered it the family resort. He remarked that he didn't understand how math and science could answer every question of his life, but could not help him with the loss of his 2 wives to cancer. And with a wink, he wrapped his arm around me while my father captured the moment forever.